Hi, I'm Georgie Dickens, host of Stratospheric Leaders, the podcast where I get to have inspired conversations with extraordinary leaders from across capital markets. Join me to hear their game-changing strategies, the personal stories and powerful sound bites behind their stratospheric success. Every episode packed with wisdom, insight and real-world lessons, the stuff they simply don't teach you in business school. If you want to elevate your game and most importantly, those around you, this podcast is for you. Enjoy. In this episode of Stratospheric Leaders, I am delighted to welcome back Lance Uggla. Lance founded Markit and later led IHS Markit through major growth and its eventual acquisition by S&P Global for $44 billion. And I want to use the words of Rich Handler, CEO of Jefferies, to describe Lance. As he puts it, Lance is a visionary trend anticipator, an entrepreneur extraordinaire, a masterful business builder, a consistent culture carrier, a maniacal client pleaser, a successful and intuitive deal doer, and the ultimate shareholder value maximiser. And most importantly, he said, along the way, Lance has never lost track of his number one priority, his family. And he also defines what it means to be a truly loyal friend. Now, Lance, as somebody who is deeply humble, and I think humility is such an important leadership characteristic, I do have to ask, how does it land hearing the words of Rich?
Well, those are humbling words to hear. And, over the years, Rich has been an active supporter of me through my, business growth and ultimate sale of IHS Markit to S&P Global. He's become a personal friend. Our families are friends. And so hearing him say that in, the foreword of this book is very humbling and, of course, very appreciative as well.
You and I, Lance, have worked together for a number of years. You were one of the founder CEOs that I profiled in Stratospheric Leaders. And what really came up for me in our conversations were the lessons, the sound bites you shared. And I truly believe that one line or a lesson can change the way a person sees the world. And it has the ability to shift everything, which is why last year I called you at the beginning of 2025. And I said, look, I would love for us to compile your top 250 lessons and put it into a collection, which we did. And we have our book called Raise the Bar. And so today I wanted to take us through a series of the lessons that you shared and really unpack what does that lesson mean to you and expand what does that look like lived and breathed. And we have to start with the title because anyone I've spoken to within IHS Markit, I remember saying to them, what is a mantra that Lance uses or used to use? Raise the bar was the one that persisted. So can you speak to me about raise the bar? What does that mean?
That's one of my favorites. And I do love a tagline attached to any great strategy. But to me, raise the bar always meant never accepting today's standards are good enough and that you have to have continuous improvement and it's non-negotiable. And I thought about it when we did this book and it really, how do you raise the bar? You're constantly setting clear objectives, clear standards, and then you deliberately increase those as your capability grows together. And I think it's about excellence becoming a habit. It shouldn't be episodic. Leaders must model, and model themselves by that standard first, and then the organization. And if you can achieve the constant raising of the bar for yourself, it's going to be much easier to lead and raise the bar of the company.
I feel we may have another book coming after this because there are some more one-liners that are coming out, but excellence being a habit, not episodic. I love that. And I know when you and I spoke when we were putting together the book, it was raise the bar and then widen the gap, which I really love because it's raising the bar. And then when you're getting out ahead, it's widening the gap with your competition.
No, exactly. And I probably got a little bit of widen the gap from being a regular user of the tube in London. And I love that phrase. And I felt that when you are out in the lead with a product, telling people to raise the bar sometimes is difficult. But when you say, let's widen the gap, let's make our lead even better, it was something that became very available and something that I could lead from as a platform. And it was always around incremental progress, but continuous. And don't be always driven just by big transformations. That small incremental improvement, fantastic. Build momentum through all your daily improvements, your processes, your product gains, your decision-making cadence, small consistent gains, and then those compound over time, and the advantage grows.
I think people often don't recognize, to your point, that compounding, the small, consistent, the momentum, like that extrapolates. And I think people sometimes look for transformation, but it's like, be consistent. Like that pays dividends in the long run.
100%. And I think we've seen that actually with the British cycling team when they went on to win so many medals, gold medals, Olympics, Tour de France, all the various events. And I think the leadership there was all about incremental improvements to gain, the ultimate win.
Okay, so I want to take us to our second quote, and I'll read it out loud. And then again, what does it mean? And I'd love for you to expand on that. To build a great product, bring key market players in as design, equity, and industry partners. When they are co-creators and not just stakeholders, the relationship deepens. It aligns the product with real market needs to create lasting impact.
Yeah, well, this was really one of the premises of Markit, and it became even more important through IHS Markit, working with automotive companies, industry leaders in energy, and the financial markets. The best products that we ever were able to build were co-created with the ecosystem that we existed within. So don't build anything in isolation. And I found when customers, partners, and industry leaders helped us design the products and have real economic or strategic alignments with us, you end up reducing all your blind spots and you accelerate the adoption, you ensure you're relevant, and then that co-creation deepens commitment and overall lowers your execution risk, which ends up being a more successful product.
It's interesting because that to me is like common sense, but often not common practice. That importance or that focus on strategic alignments, you said there, to ensure you stay relevant. And it's interesting how many people don't do that.
Yeah, well, we've seen that with many great products that wane over time as markets change around them, customers' demand changes, speed of processing, technological improvements. You need to be thinking of all of those eventualities that happen around a product. And, through that, those continuous looks at yourself from the outside in order to be better play an important role. And I think it should be obvious, but to execute the obvious is hard work. And, a lot of people say all the right things, but then they're not willing to measure themselves against that execution. And I think that you'll probably ask me a question about measuring, but for me, measurement is everything.
Well, look, you mentioned the word execution, and many people have great ideas, and execution is everything. And when you and I were in conversation, you talked about the bold vision. And I think, let's underscore the word bold, like dream big. But a bold vision requires relentless execution. I mean, again, common sense, not common practice. Speak more to that.
When I think about that statement, a bold vision requires relentless execution, it really means to me that vision by itself is meaningless. You need discipline follow through, and that's critical. So how do you take those bold ideas and then translate them into priorities, translate them into milestones, translate them into accountability? And execution then becomes, the credibility where you earn your stripes, you actually achieve something. And you need to be consistent. You need to have speed. You need to have ownership. All those things are measurable. And putting measurements, whether it's 10, 100, or 1,000, and then following through and, looking at those results on a very, regular cadence, whether it's daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, to make sure you're executing, I think is critical. And for us in creating IHS Markit, measurement was, it was just a normal course of business. Everybody did it.
And if people listening were saying, okay, what are the 3 key things that are non-negotiable when it comes to measuring? What would you say are the top 3 things that, for your business, certainly, were the key items?
It would be the inputs to revenue. Okay. And the inputs to revenue are visiting customers, making calls, attending conferences, building relationships. When you do all those things, the revenue comes. What is measuring revenue this quarter versus next? Right? Those are outputs. I always look at the inputs and measure those. It's the same, secondly, on the cost side. So how do you measure the inputs costs? It's how often are you doing things? How often are you failing? What are you spending your money on? Measuring that productivity of individuals, ultimately save you money. And then they drive the final measurement, which of course is earnings. You might put all those in the buckets of financial metrics. So measuring financial inputs to me is really important. Secondly, I'd say measuring the pulse on your customers, and then also measuring the pulse on your people.
Yeah.
Happy people, happy customers, and, strong financial performance. When you put those together, you have a really, successful firm.
And it was really interesting what you said there about inputs versus outputs. It's knowing what inputs make your output true. If you know the output you're looking to achieve, what are the inputs? When you talk about the pulse of the customers and the pulse of the people, how do you do that? Is that customer surveys? Again, how do you take the pulse?
Yeah, well, definitely surveying is one of the best ways to, get a good feeling of how things are going in the company. But, if you're asked to survey something, you don't send out the 10 toughest questions that, are going to depress you when you get the results. You send out a handful of questions that demonstrate your greatness, and then you send out another handful that you're curious about. But ultimately, for me, surveying a great view of your trends and your improvements quarter over quarter. So if you survey twice a year, then twice a year, you're on 2 or 3 questions, you're seeing if you're improving. And I think that's really relevant. Same on the people side. So people and customers. But ultimately, at least once a year or once every 2 years, I'd like to hire an independent third party that would actually do 100 customer visits, meet 200 people in the company, and in an anonymous, thoughtful way, really make sure you have the pulse on what's happening. Because I think we love hearing the good news. We like explaining away the bad news. And that's not a great leadership style.
No, I suppose ultimately we don't know what we don't know, which is where those surveys, blind spots, or they shine a light on the things that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah. And whatever you measure is going to get managed and improved. So ultimately, you've got to make that happen, and getting the right metrics, focusing attention on the outcomes, very important. Aligning the teams around the information, find problems early, allowing yourself to drive better decisions. Poor metrics create false confidence. That's what I would say. And good metrics create clarity.
Yeah, and to your point, the more you're measuring things, that finding problems early, things become discoverable.
100%. Very, very important.
There are many more one-liners just saying that are coming out of this. So, which is
you
great.
You can use those in the building of your company, Georgie.
But they are, and I think to your point, this measurement is so critical. And what we measure, what we put our attention on, expands. And you said that what we measure gets managed. And it's all these things, common sense, not common practice. People know they need to measure things, but it's not always done. And look, your businesses have had extraordinary success. So I think it's really uncovering here. What are the secret sauce? What have made those outcomes true? And as an innovator, as Rich said, an entrepreneur extraordinaire and an extraordinary business builder, it takes me to a question on innovation. And one of the quotes that you talked about is innovation. You will make mistakes. That's part of the journey, and things are not always going to go your way. And what you shared is when these things happen, as they will, focus forward. What matters then? It's how you recover, how you learn, how you move on. Can you speak more to that?
Yeah, well, first off, when I think about innovation means you'll make mistakes, I actually think failure's inherent to great progress, right? You've got to have failures to be able to innovate at the most important, or optimal level. And innovation always requires us to experiment, and experimenting involves uncertainty in everything. So the goal to me was never to avoid mistakes. It was just to make them smaller, learn quickly, and then apply that forward. And so, when I think about the comment of focus forward, it was, how do you, be resilient? Don't focus on perfection. Resilience is what you want. And strong innovators, they don't dwell on setbacks. If you get set back when you're innovating, drive through it. Get the insight from that. Adapt, make change fast, redirect your energy, and start focusing on the next solution. And so recovery speed actually can become a competitive advantage, for an innovative company. A lot of companies don't recover from failure. They have a failure, they get depressed, a lot of long faces. You need to come in that next day and you got to recover. And the faster you recover, the better. And if it takes 3 aspirins, take the 3 aspirins and, get back to work.
Yeah. And I suppose there can be emotion, but you can't be too emotional because depression, emotions are contagious. As a leader, it's that focus forward, learn, move on.
Yeah, no, exactly.
You used the word resilience, and when we were discussing the quotes, this is just as a side, but as you said that, it just came out for me. I was asked in a TV interview the other day, and curious to get your thoughts before I share mine. Are leaders, successful leaders, are they more resilient than those who are not successful? And I'm curious what your thoughts are hearing that question.
I think it depends on the type of, operation, product, set of products, it depends on the company you're running. But for me, resiliency was critical in terms of the success of IHS Markit. Because in every aspect, when you run a winning product, everybody's trying to take market share from you, right? Hence widen the gap. When you're in a number 2 or number 3 product, you have a tendency to use price to win market share and therefore, damage the TAM that you're operating in. Instead of creating a better product and offering it at the same price, you create a better product and offer it at a cheaper price. And then you try to recover that and both lose. And so to me, I think it really, resiliency is a key leadership quality for the businesses that I operated in. And it required, constant attention to maintain the highest level of resiliency.
Yeah. I look at leaders in today's world and the pace of change. We're inundated with new entrants, AI, automation, tokenization, private versus public markets. There's so much. And I look at leaders, their travel schedules, their schedules, the expectations that come with the role. And I think there's a baseline of resilience that's higher than others. Because I think physiologically, not everyone, and that's okay, not everyone can operate at that level.
No, there is, the management of the stress that surrounds the operating environment. I think, if you can handle the stress and manage the stress through other outlets, I think that you ultimately will be a better leader. And, a calmer leader giving clear instructions is always better than, the loud, noisy leader giving unclear instructions. And so to me, it's important. When you think of change, the change technology, I started in 1986 in a trading room that didn't have Excel, Word, the internet, cell phones. So you just take those, like we talk about AI today. All of a sudden people have cell phones, they have emails, they have word processing. They don't need to use a calculator and learn how to use an HP 12C, which many won't know what an HP 12C even is. But, learning how to operate a calculator, a scientific calculator, was part of, the training of the late 80s. As we moved to 90s, that disappeared. And then object-oriented programming came in. So things were being calculated at a much faster pace. So instead of having to have 20 salespeople, you could actually answer as many queries with 10. So you had efficiencies coming because people could do things faster and be more productive. You then had moves, to large cloud-based services that allowed you to reduce costs of, costly big hosted solutions that had all sorts of inherent issues with speed. As people wanted things faster around the world, you could move towards the cloud and improve that. And I remember the first cloud decision I made, there was 2 finalists in the room, Amazon and Michael Dell. And of course, everyone said, Dell's a technology company, Amazon's a shopping platform. Who are you supposed to do your first big cloud expense with? And we went with Michael Dell. He sold the business to NTT Data. And along came Amazon, investing billions of dollars. And within 5 years, we made the move to, transform ourselves to Amazon Web Services. And, those types of decisions require a lot of resiliency.
Yeah.
Because you're spending money, you're making big transformative decisions, and then you're having to change and keep everyone motivated through another transformation project. So yes, all important. Resiliency is definitely a great word and an important one.
Yeah. And as you said, stress management, knowing your outlets. Beforehand, you've talked about your on switches, make sure you know your on switches and you're activating those. When we talked about innovation, we talked about, failure is inevitable. And also people may make mistakes. And, you've said in one of our conversations, don't waste time blaming people when something goes wrong. And yet often that's easy to do. So can you speak to me more about how you don't do that, how you don't blame people? And what do you think the outcome is of not, pointing fingers?
Yeah, I think it's easy to point fingers and it's hard to take responsibility. And for me, blame kills all learning and trust. How are you going to learn if you think you're going to make a mistake and then get blamed for it? So I think blame is a really poor leadership style. Even if you know what happens, don't kill the learning environment in a firm through a blame culture. And I think when failure occurs, leaders should focus on systems, decisions, and assumptions. Don't look for a scapegoat. And accountability still exists, but the goal has to be improvement and never punishment.
I love that. The goal has to be improvement, never punishment. It's so important. I think people can get caught up in that emotional reactivity, and yet that can have such a negative ripple in an organization. Another quote I want to take you to, which is different, but there's I suppose a thread that links it to is individual performance. And, when you talked about having a growth, a learning environment, you can work with people on underperformance, is what you stated. However, if a person's values and characteristics are misaligned with a company culture, it will be toxic for an organization. They have to be removed. And yet so often I've seen in organizations, they allow that behavior to persist because they're big P&L providers. So how do you manage those toxic individuals?
Okay, toxic individuals to me means you have to let them go. If they're individuals that are underperforming, when I think of values and character misalignment as being toxic, I always said you have to remove it. So culture matters more than talent at any moment in time in a firm. And I think that plays well within a sports club, a racing team. Culture matters. What do? You have to, develop the right skills and, make sure that you have the values that will define behavior. If somebody's undermining trust or integrity or respect of the organization, then the organization wins over the individual.
You said that about culture matters more than talent. I remember reading the All Blacks. They said that they have like a no dickhead policy. Is their words, not mine. But they said, however talented you are, if you're not the right cultural fit, if you're not a team player, doesn't matter how skilled you are at passing the ball or tackling, like there is no place for you in the team.
No, I agree with that 100%.
Where I want to take us to is about the people within an organization. And you said, look, the best ideas can come from anywhere in the organization. Innovation has no hierarchy. So it's about creating a culture where every voice is valued. Because if you focus solely on the voices at the top, there's maybe some really interesting ideas that you could be overlooking. How do you do that in principle?
Well, first off, I don't think, innovation's definitely not hierarchical, right? Innovation doesn't just come from CEO and the executive team meeting in a private room. Innovation comes from your salespeople, your tech leaders, your product development teams. It come from everyone. Come from your finance department, your legal department. So my view is innovation has to be part of the culture, and it should never be hierarchical. And great leaders have to create environments where people feel safe to contribute. Some people in some firms maybe feel like contributing a new idea, they're going to be shot down, or somebody's going to feel jealous or concerned about what they have to say. But my view is people need to feel safe to contribute regardless of their role or their title. And ignoring the voices outside of leadership often means that you're going to miss the best insights.
I love that. Innovation has to be part of the culture. So it's lived and breathed. It's not just a nice word that's emblazoned on a wall or on a website. Like it's an entity. It's a living entity.
Agree.
So great leaders are defined during the toughest situations. When everything is going right, it's easy. So talk to me about that. Great leaders are defined during the toughest situations.
I actually think that leadership is earned when you're under pressure. That's when you're tested. When conditions are easy, anyone can lead. You show up. If the market's growing at 15% around you and you're growing at 17%, you've really only added a couple points of, added value. If markets are growing at 3% and you're growing at 15%, you're taking market share. You are the definer in the marketplace. I look at it and I think when conditions are easy, anyone can lead. But in adversity, the real leaders have to show up. They got to be calm. They got to use judgment. They have to have moral clarity. And, in tough times, you've got to earn trust. This is what it matters the most.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think it's in tough times where if you are a trusted leader, people will go above and beyond for you. I think it really starts to pay dividends.
No, I agree with that.
I always say to my children, hard work is a minimum. And you said in one of our conversations, to be a successful entrepreneur, you're going to have to work harder than 99% of people you know. Can you speak more to that?
If anybody has the thought of creating a new company and bringing it to success is going to be easy, they're starting the wrong career. So an entrepreneur, I think, has to work, 2 times harder than anybody else around them. And that success of a good entrepreneur requires extreme, and I say extreme in the quotes, extreme commitment. You have to show up. You got to have sustained intensity. You got to have resilience, which we already spoke about. You got to have personal sacrifice, which is hard to do. And you'll have a lot of pressure for personal sacrifice. And it's not just about long hours. It's about relentless focus. Constantly. I remember just constantly thinking about Markit and IHS Markit. It was in every conversation. Every business article I read, I could relate it to IHS Markit. Any learnings I had, I could relate to IHS Markit. Any leadership book I read, I could relate back to IHS Markit. So it's a relentless focus, lots of energy, and, real ownership, over long periods of time.
How do you relate to the word obsessive?
I think it's a good word. I think it's okay to be obsessive as an entrepreneur, because if you're not, you're probably going to fail. But don't be obsessive over the wrong things in life. Take that obsessive, if you have an obsessive nature towards success and achievement, then use it as a benefit and win with it.
Yeah, I listened to Toto Wolff in Davos recently speak, and he talked about his obsessiveness, and you've talked about attention to detail. I was listening to him, thinking, I feel like I'm listening to Lance, because like the things he measures are extraordinary, the things he cares about. It's an obsessiveness, but in such a passionate and such a positive way.
Yeah, and I love it. And, one, quote in the book that I loved that you referred to me a couple times was, how involved in the detail, do you overmanage or undermanage? And my view is when I thought about that, effective leadership, it requires you to adjust to the right altitude, right? What's the right altitude for the problem you're dealing with? And you've got to understand the detail well enough to make informed decisions. You're the leader, know the detail well enough so you can make the right decisions. If you can't make the right decisions, then ask the right questions. At least spot the risk. Be close enough, but don't suffocate the teams. Then you're doing the opposite. You try to solve the problem, you overmanage, you suffocate. So my view is oversight's never micromanagement. It's just not. It's not micromanagement. It's adjusting yourself to the right altitude to assist the team to make even better decisions.
And with that being at the right altitude, do you think that's something inherently your intuition tells you what the right altitude is? Or is that something you really have to spend time thinking, what is the right altitude? I'm curious where you sit on that.
I think you have to know what the wrong altitude is before you can figure out what the right one is. So the wrong one is, you're suffocating me, right? Imagine the people coming to work every day going, oh God, yeah, great leader, suffocates me every day, right? So that's not a good outcome. Or great leader, we're doing well, but he doesn't know any of the detail, asks all the wrong questions, or she asks all the wrong questions. That's not good. So you need to be able to adjust to the right level for the problem in front of you. And that is never too light or too hard. It just isn't. It's always between the wings of the possibility to either under or overmanage.
And for me, it's about that agility, isn't it? It's that calibration or that recalibration and not a one size fits all. One of the last quotes that I want, and one of our very, very first conversations, you shared this quote, which I'm going to speak to in a second. And I share it all the time because I think it's so simple, yet so valuable. You talked earlier on today about curiosity, and you're clearly like relationships people, whether it's clients, customers, or any stakeholder. It's about building relationships and that curiosity. And you said to build great relationships, be interested and be interesting. Can you speak more to that? Because it's a simple statement, yet if you do that well, that has a very big amplification impact.
Yeah, I think especially with dynamics around people. So if you take that and apply it to customers, right? Customers, you need to be interested in them. You're serving them. They're paying you for the products you deliver to them. They want you to be interested in them, understand their business, understand their growth pains, understand their challenges financially, be engaged. Then the customer has to be interested in you being in their ecosystem. So that means you need to be interesting. And interesting means that you can show up and relate to the person that you're talking to. Yeah. And so if, I played, World Cup rugby for 10 years, and all I knew was rugby. And I showed up at every customer, and my interesting points were only about rugby. I can tell you, you'd probably leave 90% of the world aside. And so to be interesting, you're a great athlete. What does it mean to be a great athlete in 20 other sports? What does it mean to be a musician or dancer or a great writer? And, the way you can develop that point of the ability to be more interesting is to read and study more. And so I think finding time as a leader to make sure they're aware of what's going on in the world, what changes are going on in the world around you, what are the interesting stories, where is there suffering, where is there charity required. This is really important. And when you develop those skills around the people aspects of your business, either inside or outside the firm, it will shine through and allow people to become more connected to you, and therefore it gives you an ability to create a competitive edge.
Yeah, I just think it's so powerful. And to your point, I think sometimes we think we're interesting because we know a lot about what we know, but it's, again, understanding more about the world. And so that word you use, be relatable. And last question, just as we kind of come to a close, and it isn't a quote from the book, but I wonder, what's one thing most people come to advice for you on? What are the themes?
Well, one thing is different than the themes. I'll tell you, I'd say that on a weekly basis, I would say people like to pressure test their ideas against something that they consider was successful.
Okay.
So I would say that through the history, if you think there was, just say 20,000 people in IHS Markit, maybe average of 10,000 over the course of the 20 years, or 5,000, and the turnover is, 10% a year. Well, there was probably, close to 100,000 people that went through the corridors of IHS Markit in the time that I was leading it. And many of those individuals grasped the entrepreneurism that Markit represented at a time in the financial markets, or IHS Markit represented in this kind of golden information age. And they went on to do interesting things. And so the most common thing that I find I'm asked to do is to, have a discussion like this where, somebody starting something new is looking for, somebody to be a sounding board against an idea that they're interested to take forward. And I think when that happens, I feel very privileged that people would consider me to have that conversation with them. And so most of the time I say yes. I can't do that all my time, but I, at least weekly, I say yes. I think today I said yes twice from individuals that pass through IHS Markit corridors in different parts of the world. And I look forward to those conversations. And at least probably 10 times, I've invested alongside those individuals and been mentors and advisors as they grew those new opportunities. And so it's a privilege to be asked.
So to one of the individuals who he put something on LinkedIn about the book, and he credited you as he started two very successful businesses. And he said, all his, the entrepreneurial spirit and all the, I suppose, the strategies that underpin entrepreneurial success, he credits you with. So it doesn't surprise me that people come to you for that, to be the sounding board, to be the challenger, and to hold the mirror up to them.
No, I like doing it. And I usually have two questions. I want to understand is, what's your moat? Mm-hmm. To me, the moat, the wider and deeper the moat is, the better opportunity for success, right? And I don't want the moat to be just first mover or price. Those are things that, to me, can be beaten. It's got to be an idea, and then you've got to, be able to demonstrate how can you make that moat even wider or even deeper. And then I want the numbers, the science to work before I get described all the art. So to me, science is math. Does the math work? The TAM, the pricing, the cost structure, what you're trying to do. I just want to pressure test the math. That takes me like 15 minutes and I can know if the math works. And then ultimately you want to apply that math. Now I want to hear the art. The artist has to come out. What's the passion sound like? What is the, do they have a multi-tenored path to success that, has, the right amount of opportunity in it for them to win. And I love hearing it. When I don't hear it, I'm happy to tell them that they've got to go back to the drawing board and do some more work.
Yeah, being the truth teller. Well, look, I do feel like there's a new book that we're building already. I think today we've planted the seed because there are so many other wonderful sound bites that have come up. So I hope this is the start of many more conversations where we can explore the insight from the book and really unpack them, because I come away from every conversation feeling up-leveled, energized, inspired. And I know everyone who listens to you and who's worked for you feels the same. So thank you for the gift of your time and for just being so gracious in sharing the how-to with us.
Thanks. I appreciate all your time, Georgie, and your focus on raising the bar as well. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks, Lance. If you want to see the full episode, please do look at Apple and Spotify under Stratospheric Leaders, or go to YouTube where it will be under Georgie Dickens. I hope you enjoyed the full episode. There are so many great sound bites shared.